Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar series analyzing how the election outcome will affect federal policy in the landscape of various industries. In today's discussion, we'll be focusing on government contracting under a Biden administration. My name is Emily Unash, and I'm a Senior Associate in Venable's Government Contracts Practice Group. My practice involves a wide range of government contract issues, from regulatory counseling and investigations to bid protests, claims, and mergers and acquisitions. I'm here today with my colleagues Josh Raymond and Josh Feinstone. Josh Raymond is the co-chair of Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Group, and Josh Feinstone is a Senior Policy Advisor with Venable. I'll turn the floor over to my colleagues now to introduce themselves and start the presentation.
Hi, good morning. This is Josh Feinstone with Venable. I appreciate Emily laying that out as Senior Policy Advisor here. We've got some things we want to talk to you guys about the election and how things shook out. Before I get started, I did want to give Josh Raymond, my colleague, an opportunity to introduce himself briefly.
Yeah, hey everybody, it's Josh Raymond, co-chair of the Legislative and Policy Group. We are a group that works to do advocacy on Capitol Hill and throughout the agencies for multiple industries and clients of our firm, made up of both Democrats and Republicans and alumni, congressional alumni, executive appointee alumni, and folks that sort of expertise on working policies through Congress and the administration. So I'm really happy to be here with you all, and we've got Josh Feinstone, who is our kind of resident political prognosticator and Charlie Cook, as you'd say, and I think can walk you all through kind of how we see what happened, and really much more importantly, since that's been very well covered, how we see the effect on business overall and then in contracting specifically with Emily. So thanks all for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And so just to level set in the first two slides, wanted to talk about the results in both the presidential, the senatorial, and I'll talk a little bit about the House of Representatives, as that has certainly gotten much more interesting than I think people thought it was going to be. But to level set, we have President Biden. Here in the slide it says 290, but he's actually at 306 electoral votes, well over the needed electoral vote to assume the presidency. And today we have Georgia that will certify their elections. Pennsylvania and Michigan will certify their elections on Monday. The president is still contesting the election. He is going through multiple legal channels and lawsuits, many of which have been thrown out, and none of the lawsuits have done anything to bring up enough issues in Arizona or Nevada or Wisconsin or Georgia or anywhere else that would overturn the sheer number of votes in which he lost in any of those states. And so at this point, it seems like the president's strategy is to attempt to have Republican state legislatures, namely in Michigan and Pennsylvania, to overturn the will of the popular vote of the state and send a different set of electors than the state certified electors to Congress. There's a process on how all that would play out. We do not think it is likely to play out, nor is it prudent, but we will continue to watch that. But all indications that we see is that President-elect Biden will be the next president of the United States, will be inaugurated on January 20th, and much of what's happening now is unfortunate, and hopefully we move past it fairly quickly. So that's a level set on the presidency. Not yet fully wrapped up, but very, very close to doing so. And next we turn our attention to the U.S. Senate. As many of you know, Republicans have secured 50 seats in the U.S. Senate. Democrats have secured 48, or members of the Senate who may not be a Democrat, but certainly caucus with the Democrats. That total has been 48. There are two runoffs in Georgia that will be the first week in January. David Perdue versus John Ossoff, Kelly Loeffler versus Pastor Warnock. Those races could determine control of the Senate. If the Democrats are able to flip both of those seats, then it would be a 50-50 split control. And any time that happens, then the vice president, who is also the president of the Senate, would be the tie-breaking vote if necessary. Under that situation, you would likely see Democrats have control of the gavel due to the Democrat Party being in the White House. And so very interesting races and how things shook out. The Democrats were able to flip 2 seats, Arizona and Colorado. Republicans were able to flip Alabama, and there were holds in Montana, Iowa, South Carolina, Maine, and North Carolina. The other holds that the GOP had were somewhat expected, and so a very interesting turnout there. Quickly touching on the House of Representatives, Republicans did much better than expected than the Democrats did. They have so far flipped 9 seats, and they could end up somewhere in the 211 to 212 range. There's multiple seats that are still outstanding. There's count still ongoing in New York. There's count still going on in California. There's a runoff in Louisiana, and I believe that there is a recount in Iowa. And so depending on how those votes shake out, what we do know is that Democrats will have the slimmest majority in the House of Representatives in quite some time. And so the way that this all shakes out is you have a pretty definitive Biden victory. You could have split control in the Senate, but it's probably likely that Republicans will hold on. And you have a very narrow House majority for the Democrats in the House of Representatives. And so that's kind of a level set on the outcome. But now let's talk a little bit about how that plays into the next 60 days. First of all, as we talked about before, what is Trump's posture and how long does it take to finalize the results of the presidential election? Will certainly weigh in. This week we saw planning for the next Congress take place with leadership elections in both the House and the Senate. They will move towards steering committee meetings where they will select open spots for committees. There's an open appropriations chairman race on the Democrat side. There's a ranking member spot that is open on the House Energy and Commerce side for Republicans. And so even though we're still waiting on the results of the presidential, planning is happening now, and the wheel is turning, and we're moving forward to the 117th. Some of the things that could impact the 117th Congress, as we've talked about before, are certainly the Georgia January runoff elections. Some things that the Congress needs to figure out over the next 45 days now will be the government runs out of funding on December 11th. The House and Senate appropriators have been discussing an omnibus bill. It is unclear whether or not the House and Senate leadership and rank and file would be behind such plan in both chambers, and whether or not President Trump will sign that. There's also talk of another COVID stimulus bill that could take place before the end of the year. You have unemployment insurance that is running dry for many people. You have the Paycheck Protection Program that many small businesses throughout the United States have tapped into that has run dry of funds that could be used for a recharge. You've also got some children's nutrition SNAP funding that could be recharged. And so while I'm unsure that you're going to see some massive COVID bill, there's certainly some things that could be done in a CR or an omnibus. And so the big things that Congress has to do to finish is the National Defense Authorization Act, some sort of government funding bill, whether that be a CR or an omnibus, and then whether or not they do a middle-of-the-road stimulus bill, a large stimulus bill, or they recharge some of the programs that the CARES Act passed, fold that into an omnibus or a CR, and then in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, go for some sort of bigger stimulus package. The wild card in all of this is President Trump. There simply is not a clear indication by anybody as to what he is actually willing to do. And so there is some concern that you could pass an omnibus, you could pass a stimulus bill, you could pass the NDAA. You send that over to the president, he doesn't sign it. And so how he handles these things will be a big indicator as to what the art of the possible is to get done. Now, Congress is set to leave around the December 11th date. The Senate might stay a little bit longer, but you really don't have much time to do a lot of big things. And so with next week being the Thanksgiving holiday, they'll come back for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and try to get a lot done. And we're certainly going to be watching all of that. Looking ahead to the 117th Congress, some of the things that we feel pretty confident about, Nancy Pelosi has already won the nod from her caucus to be the nominee for Speaker of the House. As you know, she has to go down to the floor of the House of Representatives, and she has to win a majority vote on the floor with a narrow margin. That may be more difficult than it has been in past years, but we expect Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker of the House in the 117th Congress. As you can see, we don't know how the House Appropriations will shake out just yet. We do know that Representative Neal will be the Ways and Means Chairman, Representative Pallone will be the House Energy and Commerce Chairman, Rep. Waters will be the House Financial Services Chairperson. Over on the Senate, if Georgia cuts the Republicans' way, same situation, Mitch McConnell will be the leader of the Republican conference, and he will be the Senate Majority Leader. Under split control, then a decision between Minority Leader Schumer and Majority Leader McConnell on how they are going to handle those duties when need to take place. This has happened in the past. Won't go into all that today. And then the Senate committee chairs there as we see it. So with that, I think that level sets for us kind of where we are at, and I will turn it back over to Emily.
Well, thank you, Josh. And so we're going to get into some of the government contract-specific projections for the Biden administration. And as you were just talking about, although the Democrats will have control over both the presidency and House of Representatives by a narrow margin, if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate after the runoff elections, we would project that there may be an increased likelihood of a government shutdown at some point. Would you agree with that?
It would be not in the best interest of any party to see a government shutdown. With the Biden administration coming in, I think a return to normalcy is something that is going to be at a premium. In fact, you're already starting to see Republican senators discuss that President-elect Biden deserves to have his own cabinet. So that would start to suggest that you would see less of a logjam and more of a fundamental agreement that we are going to make things work. So I do not believe that it is in the best interest of Republicans and Democrats to shut down the government. I believe that the longstanding relationship between the President-elect and Senate Majority Leader McConnell will allow for deals to be brokered. I think it's much more likely that you're going to have turbulence in the House of Representatives with a deal that the President-elect and the Senate Majority Leader craft, and Speaker Pelosi responsible for ushering that through the House of Representatives. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you will have more moderate Republicans in the House of Representatives than before, and they also will not be in the majority. And so you could see, if a bipartisan deal is struck with the President and the Senate, that a bipartisan group of members will ensure that it has the necessary votes to pass the House. So I would at this point put chances of a shutdown very unlikely unless you have a situation where the Speaker of the House cannot get a majority of her majority to support whatever deal the President and the Senate Majority Leader have crafted. But Speaker Pelosi is very, very skilled in knowing where her caucus is and where her votes are. And so my projection is that you will see great effort to avoid situations like a shutdown.
Well, that's certainly good to hear. I think, the last thing we need at this point is another, extended government shutdown. So hopefully we will not see that, even if the Democrats don't end up keeping the Senate.
The Republicans, yeah. Well, and Emily, I would just say one more thing, that's forward-looking. Right now, we need to fund the government to get to January 20th or beyond. And we do not know what the president may or may not do, and it's very likely that a CR is passed and it may have to come back to the House and the Senate to override a veto. That is certainly something that people are discussing.
Okay. So another thing that we've talked about is we may see a shift in funding. I think it's very common when there's a shift between, a Democratic administration and a Republican, or Republican to Democratic, there are shifts in kind of priorities in funding. So we would expect potentially to see a shift from maybe not a decrease in defense spending, but certainly an increase in spending with certain civilian agencies in a Biden administration. And certainly that would, there would be a waterfall effect down to contracts in civilian agencies. I have seen that Biden has stated as part of his platform that he didn't foresee any major reductions in the U.S. defense spending. So would you agree with that, Josh, that we're not likely to see reductions in defense spending, but we may see some increase in civilian spending?
So going back to the Obama-Biden administration, they were very keen on having one-to-one spending. And so I could certainly see an attempt to bring a balance back where the Trump administration had increased defense and probably not abided by that one-to-one ratio. And so I think that's where you're seeing the principle of what he's saying and where that's originated from. How it plays out, especially if the Senate appropriators are in charge, is that it's very likely that you will see the outcome that Biden's looking for. If the House of Representatives were Republican, but the Senate was in Democrat control, you might see a little more pushback on that, akin to what we saw in the latter half post-2010 of the Obama administration. And so, I would agree with that assessment. I believe that the Senate appropriators will be much more likely to want to have no shutdowns and a continuation of spending. And if they need to balance out the 1v1 ratio between defense and non-defense spending, they may be more likely to do that than if the Republicans held the House of Representatives.
Thank you. I think some other areas where we might see changes in funding under a Biden administration are some of those other maybe hot button or policy issues. One that we thought of was immigration-related activities. I know under the Trump administration, we've seen a pretty heavy crackdown on certain visas like H-1B visa holders, and particularly for contractors, the use of foreign temporary labor. So would you expect to see changes in, for example, immigration-related spending, environmental spending? Another area that I think has been, all over the news recently and just part of the cultural changes that we're seeing is race relations. And we'll talk about that a little more on some of the coming slides, but one area that we think may be a policy focus for a Biden administration is helping to improve race relations throughout the country, particularly as related to police departments. Could you foresee changes in funding in those areas as well?
Yes, I think that as part of its first 100 days, a concerted effort will take place to have some legislation and executive orders that deal with race relations in the United States. I also think as it pertains to immigration, you will see a reversal and a rollback of many of the Trump immigration policies. And I think that there will be a concerted effort to try to figure out a solution for dreamers, for example. And in the last administration, that issue was hung over the head of Democrats saying, if you work with us on all this stuff, we might do this. And I just think that those kind of postures are going to go away. And so I would see a rejection of those policies. But I'm not sure I would see it through legislation. I think I'd see it through executive order.
Got it. Let's move to the next slide. You talked a little bit about a potential COVID-19 package that would come through. Do you think we'd expect that before the Biden administration begins, or would we expect it before the end of the year, or would it be sometime in the new year?
Yeah, so I am not high that there's going to be another COVID stimulus bill before the end of the year, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, the legislation that was under negotiation between Secretary Mnuchin and Pelosi was not a bill that Republican senators were going to easily accept, and they probably did not have enough Republican senators to be over a majority, so they probably didn't even have 25 to 26 Republican senators who were in favor of what the Mnuchin-Pelosi bill was being crafted. I believe that McConnell, on the other side of the election, has determined that he can cut a better deal with the President-elect Biden, and then have that be presented to the House as a take it or leave it approach. The dollar amount that Pelosi wanted was around $2.2 trillion. The dollar amount that McConnell wanted was around $800 billion to $1 trillion. McConnell and Pelosi have not spoken in the last 6 weeks. So in order to have a COVID measure done before they adjourn, you would need negotiations to be taking place right now with appropriators and authorizers involved. The deal would have to be crafted a week before it was on the floor. And you're just not seeing any of that activity. And so while everyone is saying the right things, that it's something that we should do, what I think is much more likely to happen is you have either a CR or an omnibus or parts of an omnibus with a CR, like let's say the Department of Homeland Security isn't able to pass, but they'll just continue funding with that. And you'll take elements of what passed in the CARES Act and you'll recharge it. That's what I think ultimately they'll do between now and the end of Congress. But I do think that a larger COVID bill is coming. I think that we are seeing cases ramp back up. There's very real concern that we may need to go back to some of the protocols that we engaged in March and April. If that happens, you will have a tremendous blunt impact to the economy, and not just small businesses, restaurants, entertainment. They've weathered one storm. They've been waiting for a PPP recharge, and so they're going to need something, or else they're not going to survive. And so I do think that a bill is coming. I think that bill will focus on testing. I think that as you see a vaccine come on board, with the promising news that we've had even this week, you still are going to need testing, because it's going to take a while for the vaccine to get out and everywhere. So you're going to need to know very quickly who has it and how far their chain goes. And the only way you're going to do that is with improved testing and things that don't take 6 to 7 days in the lab, but are handheld, taken home, 30 minutes. And those products are coming online. In fact, the FDA CLE waiver certification for one such company was done. I think it was Lucerne Health now has a handheld device that you can take home in testing. And so all these things kind of matter. And in answer to your question, we're likely going to need a lot of money spent to help not only patch us through if we go into a downturn, but then also start an even more robust recovery than what we've already seen.
Yeah, all of that makes sense. I think, regardless of whether another stimulus package, COVID package comes out, I would expect to see more contract spending related to COVID. So I know we've had clients who've been involved in some of the contracts with HHS that have gone out related to, trying to find a vaccine, a cure, or treatments. We may, as you're talking about additional testing, we may see contracts that go out related to testing or distribution of the vaccine as well. So I would expect to see additional, there was certainly a flurry of contract spending, particularly with HHS kind of earlier on in the summer, earlier in the pandemic, and I would expect to see additional spending out of HHS and, as we move closer to getting the vaccine available as well. I've had some clients ask, well, will there be changes to bid protests as a result of the change in administration? My guess is probably no. I think, if we see a lot more contract spending coming out, I mean, that could go one of two ways. I think sometimes when there are fewer contracts, fewer procurements, then there actually is more, competition, and there may be more room for bid protests in that sense. But I think it may be hard to predict at this point whether there will be, a large increase in bid protests, either the Government Accountability Office or the Court of Federal Claims, either, just generally or arising out of some of the COVID spending. One of the other big issues for contractors is the Trump administration had been, planning significant funding for the border wall, I think, billions of dollars. Would you expect to see those plans kind of pulled back and that spending, reallocated to different purposes? So potentially, reallocating that funding toward maybe some of, the Biden administration's high priority policies?
Yes, I absolutely believe that there will be money moved at the OMB level. That a lot of that money, I believe, the initial part of the wall, there was appropriated funds for it, but most of the money that had come later, and correct me if I'm wrong, had been moved around from other accounts. And so I think that there will be an end to a lot of that. And you will see kind of a correction by the Biden administration there. Unfortunately, I don't know the amounts and where those accounts are, but I would assume that he will not continue to fund the border wall.
Yeah, and that'll certainly have an effect on any contractors who are involved, who maybe already have contracts or were competing for contracts related to the border wall, as well as their subcontractors. Those contracts may be terminated for convenience of the government, and those contractors will be looking to submit cost claims related to that termination. Just for those of you who are joining this call today and are looking to receive CLE credit, the CLE code for today is Contracts 2020. So again, the CLE code is Contracts 2020. Moving on to the next slide, Josh, you and I had talked a little bit about some of the executive orders that may be, either being repealed or issued in the first 100 days. I think some of the major ones that we've maybe seen in the news recently are some of the major issues. One is this Executive Order 13950, which is an order on combating race and sex stereotyping. So that's been a pretty big issue for a lot of our contractors. The order instituted a federal ban on the use of workplace training that basically promotes the concept of race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating. And, for a lot of our contractors who may have programs for their employees where they're, talking about race or, trying to get their hands around that issue, as of right now, this rule is still in place, and it can pose significant challenges for contractors who are maybe trying to respond to the needs and requests of their employees, but at the same time, need to comply with these rules. I think the Department of Labor has issued some guidance and they're certainly looking into how they would enforce the rule. I would expect the Biden administration would repeal this executive order fairly quickly. I think Biden has spoken about this issue, and we would expect to see really a complete 180 on this issue under a Biden administration. Another executive order that I would expect we'll see changed or repealed rather, is Executive Order 13940, aligning federal contracting with hiring practices with the interests of American workers. So this was one of those executive orders. It was really part of a series of executive orders that President Trump issued that discussed a preference for American workers, and it was essentially a long line of attacking H-1B visas and the use of foreign temporary labor for contractors and subcontractors under government contracts. So I think we might see a repeal of those type of executive orders. I know Biden has spoken about the Buy America Act and certain domestic preference requirements that I don't see there being significant changes under a Biden administration, although I would expect for some of these immigration issues and the H-1B visas in particular that we might see a change. And Josh, please, if you have anything to say on that, please feel free to jump in as well.
No, I'm fine.
Another executive order that I think we'll likely see repealed, it would be a repeal of a repeal. So this is the Executive Order 13945. So this was an executive order that originally under the Obama administration required new contractors who were working on a follow-on contract give employees of the incumbent contractor the right of first refusal for employment. I think when Obama issued the executive order, there was a lot of maybe pushback originally. The executive order was intended to protect workers when a contract changed hands, to give them a chance to have employment, although there was some pushback because some contractors believed that it didn't give them a chance to select their preferred candidate who may have been a potentially more qualified hire. So, but we may see changes that are intended, such as the repeal of this order, that are intended to protect American workers and allow them to keep their jobs when a contract vehicle changes hands. Another rule that we might see re-implemented from the Obama administration regarded the collection of worker pay data that was sorted by race, sex, ethnicity, and job category. I think the Trump administration had stopped this collection of data, but it is possible that we'll see additional requirements on contractors to report these type of data. Let's see, we've already talked about the border wall construction. Certainly would think that, those contracts will be terminated for convenience. We have the Mexico City policy. That's just gone back and forth between Republican and Democratic administrations since Reagan. I think we could obviously see a flip back under a Biden administration. So I talked a little bit about Buy America requirements. I think I've heard some people say that they think there may be less emphasis on Buy America requirements under a Biden administration. However, his campaign statements have really kind of refuted that. I think Biden, he said he's looking to retool and revitalize American manufacturers and bring back critical supply chains to America. I don't think that we'll see really any walking back on some of the Buy America requirements or other domestic preference requirements for federal government contractors. One thing we may see a resurrection of is the Fair Play and Safe Workplaces rule, which was another Obama administration executive order for which there was a lot of pushback on this one. It was ultimately repealed by the Trump administration. But the thing that made the order so controversial was it required companies to report labor violations, but also alleged violations under, I think it was 14 federal labor laws, as well as related state labor laws. And the opponents of this rule had called it the blacklist rule because they essentially saw it as unfairly requiring contractors to report, alleged violations, which could give rise to, people potentially making up claims just to blacklist their employer from being able to get contracts. So I would expect we may, again, because I think we may see some move back toward protecting workers under a Biden administration. We may see a resurrection of this rule, but I think it could be changed, particularly because there was just so much pushback on the requirement to report alleged violations. I think we may see some changes or additional requirements that would maybe soften this rule a little bit and make it not as difficult for employers to comply with. For the Department of Labor Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP, that's huge for government contractors. I mean, that's really the agency to be watching. If you're a government contractor for employment and labor issues, the administrations have used the OFCCP as just a lever of power that is not necessarily as visible to the public as something like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Justice Department, but it sets policies that apply to contracts and contractors. So, for example, I talked a bit earlier about the executive order that President Trump issued regarding, race and sex stereotyping and prohibiting certain trainings. The OFCCP just last month put out a request for information on diversity training that might include that type of prohibited behavior. I think a Biden administration is likely to repeal that executive order, but we could see the OFCCP still requesting the same type of information or doing the same type of outreach, but on the 180 flip, where they're looking at, ways in which contractors may be eventually required to provide certain types of training. There's a lot of focus on equal employment opportunity under the OFCCP as well. So numerous requirements. There was requirements for equal pay between men and women under the OFCCP, which there was some litigation involved for that requirement that I think maybe put us back a little bit. I think there was a lawsuit against Oracle that the Labor Department lost. We may see some increases in certain requirements for minority contracting under a Biden administration, as well as, again, looking at the Department of Labor, certain changes in prevailing wage requirements. I've had clients ask about whether we would expect any major changes to Section 889 or CMMC compliance. Really not. I think those are, statutory, and we're not going to see a repeal or too much change to those requirements. If anything, I think they'll become more defined in the coming administration. Another question we've gotten a lot of is, particularly with so much of the COVID grants and contract funding that has gone out, is there going to be some sort of uptick in audits, investigations, looking at this funding? And then just generally for contracts, can contractors expect, broader or more frequent audits under a Biden administration? Generally, we would expect in a Democrat-led administration that there probably will be some increase in the number of audits for government contractors. I think under the Obama administration, there were some changes that led to a reduced number of audits, but those audits became much more detailed in nature. So it's possible that we'll see some shift back toward the Obama administration in that sense. We may also see some rollbacks or legislation that better insulate offices of Inspector General and the Department of Justice from executive influence. I think, that's been a big issue, particularly with the Department of Justice, and it can change from administration to administration. But we may see some changes that would hopefully better insulate them. So appointments that will affect government contracting, there are three groups that are probably most important for government contractors to look at: the OMB, the OF, CCP, and the GSA administrator. There's been a whole lot of talk recently in the media about Emily Murphy, the current GSA administrator. Josh, do you have any thoughts on whether Ms. Murphy will remain?
Apologies, I was on mute. I think that Emily will need to certify this election pretty quickly, and I am not at all confident that she's going to remain in her job much longer beyond that, let alone a Biden administration. I don't think it has anything to do with her personally or her performance up until this point, but I think that political factors have probably overcome her, and it's very unlikely that she continues on in her role.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting situation because, Emily Murphy has significant experience with the government. I would think, but for kind of the consternation that's been going up around her not certifying, she probably would have remained, but given just everything that we've been seeing in the media and kind of what's being seen as an unreasonable delay, I also would not be surprised if she were removed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
In terms of the court, oh, yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
I was just going to add that even this morning, Democrats in the House of Representatives who chair very important committees on the authorizing and appropriation side have demanded answers from her. And if she is unable to provide those answers in a timely manner, she will likely be brought before Congress, subpoenaed even. So it's only going to get more political very quickly.
And you would expect that to happen sometime before the new year?
If she doesn't certify the elections, things will start happening in the next week.
So when it comes to the courts, there are... So
and I'm sorry, let me clarify. Not certify if she does not sign papers that allow for the transition to begin, is what I meant to say. I apologize.
Got it. So flipping to the courts, as folks on the call may know, for judges on the Court of Federal Claims, they do not have lifetime appointments. They serve 15-year appointments. And the court allows for 16 active or non-senior judges, but right now there are only 9 non-senior judges sitting on the court. There are several judges who have just reached senior status or retired, so we would expect that there may be judges who are added to the Court of Federal Claims over the next 4 years. I think there's been a lot of delay for those judges. I think maybe it's not as much of a priority since they don't serve lifetime appointments. So we've seen judges who've been waiting for almost a year for a final vote but hopefully we will see some of those positions filled. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, those judges do serve lifetime appointments. However, we do have some of the judges who are relatively senior and maybe retiring or otherwise spots may be opening up. So I do think we could see some shifts in the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit over the next 4 years. We could also, the Supreme Court doesn't often weigh in on government contracting issues. We did recently just this summer had a ruling by the Supreme Court regarding the jurisdiction of the Court of Federal Claims under the Tucker Act. So that was an interesting ruling. I think it could potentially impact jurisdiction or increase jurisdiction for the Court of Federal Claims under the Tucker Act. But that's yet to be seen. And I think we've reached the end of our slides. I don't know if folks have questions. We're certainly happy to answer them. But I'll flip it back to you, Josh, and say, having gone through all of these issues, do you see any big changes happening just in the government contracting world, let's say in the next, as the Biden administration comes in the next year or near future?
I think it's hard to crystal ball some big changes. What I can tell you is you will see a return to the extent with which it's been missing. I'm not incredibly sure it has been all that much in some of your fields. Technocrats and experienced hands at the political levels across all agencies. I think that's going to be some of the biggest changes that you're going to see. I'm not necessarily certain that levels of funding are going to decrease drastically. I think there may be more competence than perhaps we've seen in the last 4 years across the board in some of these areas, although to some extent there's been extreme competence at many places. But so it's tough to granularly tell you exactly what's going to happen in this world with the Biden administration, but these are experienced hands that are coming in, and they're certainly going to have ideas for how things should be done. And if there was anything that was happening in the last 4 years, I would imagine things would be nipped in the bud. So that's probably the best advice I can give you on that front. Overarching, there's going to be a return to boring in D.C. D.C. will not run your life every day. You will not be hearing about what Joe Biden tweeted 5 times a day. It's just not going to happen. There is going to be this sense of there's a steady hand on the ship, and this is the direction that we're going. Not everyone may agree with the direction that we're going, but it will be much more about a functioning government and not one person within the government. And so that will be the biggest change that you will see. Things will calm down. And how that impacts this world specifically, hard to tell. I would imagine it would allow for smoother sailing. But that's the goal government-wide. That's certainly, I think, what Congress is looking to do. I think if you're searching for drama in D.C., you're going to see a tremendous amount of drama in the House Democrats. And I think you're going to see some drama between Senate Republicans and the administration. But that's going to be very minor compared to what has happened over the last 4 years.
When we talk about kind of the transition, obviously there's been, some pushback from the president on, acknowledging that Joe Biden won. Do you see any challenges with the transition at the agency level as opposed to with the executive? Do you think that process will, run the same as it always does, or will there be, new challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. The issue with the legitimacy of the presidency is a political one. The issue with the transition is much more of a mechanical. So once the transition is allowed to move forward, I think it will move forward smoothly. The issue right now is a political one where Republicans just watched 70 million people vote for President Trump, and they just saw increases in their House of Representative numbers and a surprising outcome to many in the Senate. They do not want to be seen as the individual who is telling Trump that he needs to stop doing what he is doing because they will then be at the wrath of those voters. And so there's a political problem there. However, his time is running out, and eventually he is going to need to probably move on from this. But that political problem that elected officials find themselves in within the Republican Party and the president will run its course eventually, and probably within the next week or so. I do not foresee that political issue will bleed over tremendously when the transition is allowed to get going earnestly, because the senators and members will want to see that continuation of a peaceful transfer of power, and it will provide something for people to focus on instead of the hindrance to transition. There will be the actual transition. And so, again, I think that if you do have some political people who are standing in the way of some transitional stuff, I don't think that that's going to hold for very long. You have a lot more career individuals at a lot of these agencies, a lot of these departments, who are going to work with the transition staff to make sure that everybody understands what is in progress, what is ongoing, and so the new administration can determine whether or not they're going to continue some of these things that are in play, or if they are going to shut them down.
And what about when we, look forward a little bit into January? What do you see happening under the Biden administration's first 100 days, and what do you see as kind of the primary policy issues?
Yeah, so you've already kind of heard bits and pieces about what they want to do, but infrastructure, especially bridging the digital divide, some sort of COVID response, and these are the kind of things, big movement, quick things that can be done legislatively with bipartisan support, and then the rest of it's going to need to be done through executive order. There's just some things that are not going to be able to get through Congress, but you absolutely see this administration forward-looking on even perhaps a Green New Deal. You may have elements of those things. Not all of them may make it into something that gets presented, but I think you will certainly see a push towards stimulus. A lot of the COVID responses have been recovery-related and not stimulus-related, and I think that the incoming administration is hoping that they can focus on more stimulus-type moves. I'll ask Josh Raymond if he has anything to add on that. He may not.
Yeah, I don't think I do. I mean, I think that's it's going to be hard to get a lot of stimulus done in given we have a Republican Senate, as we saw 10 years ago in 2009. I think we'll have some reversion back to that, but there's a lot of negotiation left to go, and I think there is some pressure building on both sides to come together on this. So, and get some money out, because I think people are going to start to need it after this, whatever this next lockdown or potential lockdown that we're looking at occurs.
All right, well, I think we're coming up on the end of the presentation. If there's no questions, we'll just thank everyone for joining us today for our discussion, and let you know that a recording of this session will be available shortly on our website. We hope that you will join us for other webinars in our election series that are taking place the week of November 30th. And we would invite you to visit our website, venable.com, to learn more about us as the attorneys at Venable, as well as our practice areas, and contact any of the professionals if you have any questions. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and happy Thanksgiving.